Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 10 of the Pragmatic Investor. Today I'm joined by fellow essay contributor Cameron Fen. Cameron is a doctorate student in economics and he specializes in machine learning and creating artificial intelligence models to support macroeconomic modeling. Now, today we had a great conversation about artificial intelligence and its implications for businesses today, the outlook for NVIDIA, and also how this affects the general macro market outlook. To wrap up, Cameron also gave us his pick for the Pragmatic Investor Portfolio, a company based in Australia which runs trailer parks. A very interesting stock indeed. As always, I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Welcome once again, everyone. I'm joined today by fellow essay contributor Cameron. Cameron, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so I thought a good place to start would be on one of your most recent articles because you're pretty new to Seeking Alpha, but on your last article, you got an editor's pick, and the title is quite interesting. A data scientist explains large language models and implications for businesses.
Yep. So I guess what I was trying to do with this article is essentially, convey to a lay audience or an audience of investors what this new sort of AI innovation they're getting into, right? So the idea that these large language models, people are like, okay, I can like type anything and it can respond just like a human. I think that generated a lot of buzz. But in order to really understand the implications of the model, you have to understand how these models are built, what the new innovations are, and why these innovations, or what does the technology constrain from the innovations, right? Because I think for most investors or lay people, this looks like magic, right? It's like it's a computer that basically talks to you like a human and knows a lot of interesting facts. Sometimes it says stuff that is wrong, just like a human, but it's like, it's not like, it doesn't feel like a machine. It feels like talking to a human. And so there's a lot of sort of buzz and excitement over this. But if you don't know how the models are built, then you can extrapolate and you have people saying things like, I saw there was a Twitter video where it's like, I used a colonel used an AI to use a drone to target an enemy. And when the drone realized that the pilot was getting in the way of, the objective, the drone actually eliminated, or in the simulation, eliminated the drone operator, right? And this was found to be really, this was found to be, not true. And if you don't understand how these tech works, you can get sucked into these sort of conspiracy theories like thing if we make an analogy to politics, right? So that was my sort of objective.
Yeah, it's very interesting. You bring up those limitations that AI has. I had a previous guest on a couple of weeks ago who talked about them being essentially, obviously very powerful models, but he referred to them also as the quote unquote bullshit machines.
Yeah.
All right. So in your article, you also talk about the commercial implications for companies like Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. So I just love to understand a little bit. Maybe if you can give everyone a background of just explain what the large language models are, and what your thoughts are on this for how it applies to these companies.
Sure. So the sort of innovative sort of technique that large language models use, and they're all transformer-based models, which is just a particular type of neural network. But the secret sauce is the attention mechanism. And essentially what attention does is it learns a weighted average of your inputs, right? And it gives an output that's a weighted average of the inputs. But if you train this on a large enough data and have a large, you have like 20 or 30 different attention mechanisms in a single model or more, and each of these single layers pays attention to a different sort of thing. But if you have enough of these models, what it will do is when you have a sentence like Joan is 80 years old, is she and she is going to the doctor's, is this, or actually Joan is 80 years old, her birthday is tomorrow, what age will she turn? right? And this
Mm-hmm.
attention model will pay attention to the things like 80, birthday, and it will sort of ignore all the other text, right? And this is the secret sauce behind the transformer model, where it pays attention to stuff that's important, and then it will start generating words that says like Joan is going to be 81 because it's paid attention to these important parts of the topic and not had much attention to the things that aren't important, right? And implications for big tech. I believe that this will be a rich get richer thing, with the minor exception of a little bit of worry about Google search over the horizon.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like GPT-4 is quite an improvement over GPT 3.5 and ChatGPT. And I think right now that's the model that you're using to evaluate all other models. So that should tell you which one's in the lead, right? So if you have data scientists and they have all these open source models, the way they're evaluating is how well GPT-4 rates their output, right? And so this is like the dominant model, and of course, this is developed by OpenAI, which is basically like a Microsoft subsidiary at this point, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so the one thing I worry about is, what it will happen to Google search. Will it lose some share? And it might not. I don't know. But the other thing is, it's just more costly per search, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably going to have a mechanism where essentially what happens is, someone types in a search query and they have a machine learning model that says, do I need to use a large language model or do I just do search like normal, right? But if a lot of queries end up wanting large language models, this will cut into Google's bottom line. There's an article by Semi-Analysis where essentially they calculated that each Google search has zero point 0.5 cents of profit per search, right? And
Mm-hmm.
these models cost somewhere between zero point 0.1 and 0.3 cents before all these innovations that I talked about earlier, that I talked about in my article. Hopefully that will bring that down, but as of 2022, the cost of per search, if you use a large language model, is 0.1 to 0.3 cents, and that eats into Google's sort of margin, right? Now, if you don't use a large language model when someone does a search query, then that doesn't matter. But if you do, then profitability is weaker. Uh, Other than that, though, I think big tech will benefit, and the reason they'll benefit is they have more data. Um, they have they have a lot of people that can build these models, but I don't think that's the biggest deal. And in the data science world, I think the main moat is data. It's not the model, right? There are
Mm-hmm.
thousands of data scientists that can build large language models that compete with Google. The problem that they don't have is they don't have enough GPUs and they don't have the data that Google has or Microsoft has or OpenAI has or Facebook has or Amazon has, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like just Amazon, it has more transaction data than anyone else in the world. Facebook has more social, and even with their sort of like Facebook advertising has preferences of people and again what people click and stuff like that. Same with Google, and Google has search. And then all of them have internal code, right? So one of the big uses of large language models is essentially that you can fine tune these models to help coders, write code.
Mm-hmm.
And I pay $10 for GitHub Copilot. There are probably millions of people or tens of millions of people that will pay $10 a month for GitHub Copilot. And so this is a huge business, right? And essentially, if this gets better, this could be a profit machine to maybe a smaller company like OpenAI. It probably wouldn't be much of a drop in the bucket for other companies, like the big tech. But they have
Mm-hmm.
massive amounts of data, and maybe they can do something even better than Google or OpenAI Copilot that will uh, uh, give them be more profitable, generate more revenue than something like whatever $10 a month.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, so yeah, I think they have the walled gardens and they have more data than anyone else, and so I think large language models will predominantly benefit them.
It's interesting because I was talking about this with another essay contributor on the podcast, and he mentioned that to actually run something like ChatGPT at scale, like at the scale of Google search, would be at this point economically unviable, just due to the expense of that hardware and those GPUs that are used.
Um, I guess I would disagree. I think it's possible.
Mm-hmm.
I did the analysis in my NVIDIA article, and it's actually not that large. I had another article where I talked about NVIDIA and sort of a short report on NVIDIA, saying
Mm-hmm.
the amount of GPUs that is required to justify the market cap is beyond what is necessary. But essentially, no, I don't. So right now, OpenAI has 30,000 GPUs for about 200 million queries a day. Google search, if these are numbers that I'm approximating, had 26 billion queries a day. So that's another order of 10x, right?
Mm-hmm.
100x, yeah, 100x, right?
Right.
And so yeah, and so 30,000 to wait. Okay, so wait, let me see. Yes, so Google search, I think Google search was 2 billion a day. I'm not sure. But it's essentially 10x, right? And 10x number of GPUs is not unreasonable. You have 30,000 right now with OpenAI, and OpenAI will get 300,000 if, for instance, they are the only large language model and they do as much large language modeling as there is Google search. So
Mm-hmm.
you only need 10x more GPUs. And even with that, there are innovations over the past 3 months since 2023 has started. Quantization, there's a new technique called QLoRa, which is a combination of quantizations and an adapter, which is just, these are just large language models. There's a particular sort of techniques that you use to make these models more effective. There's QLoRa, there's a model distillation, which has been a thing for a long time, but essentially what model distillation is you get a big model and it teaches a small model by giving the small model a lot of examples, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then quantization is obviously, instead of using 32-bit float, you use like 4-bit float or something like that. So your numbers are less accurate, but both of these techniques have shown that they produce models just as accurate as the models without quantization, without
Mm-hmm.
adapters is another thing in itself, and I don't want to explain that, but without quantization and without distillation. Now, if you combine these things, you can essentially run I think a 64 billion large language model on a single GPU. You know,
Mm-hmm.
OpenAI uses probably 5, 6, or 8 GPUs per large language model and per query or whatever. And so if you cut down from 8 to like 4 or 8 to 2, then the 10x is going to be something like 2x or 3x, and so it's very doable with the new innovations. Does that make sense? I'm sorry if I'm like not being clear.
No, no, it makes perfect sense. I just could you repeat the numbers then? So the search is done on ChatGPT versus Google search?
Yeah, so against essentially Google queries, I think 2 billion searches a day, right?
Right.
Right right now OpenAI is querying an estimated 200,000 large language model searches a day, right?
Right. Okay. So that would be
It's a 10x. Let me I can
no,
pull up my
because
article.
two
Let me see
hundred
if I can
thousand would be 10x would be
200 million.
2,000,000.
200 No,
Right.
it's
Okay.
200 OpenAI is querying 200 millions
Okay. All
or
right.
at least
Okay.
we it can handle 200 million a day.
Okay. All right. Okay. That makes a bit more sense. It's very interesting because you touched on my next question because I was also going to ask you about NVIDIA. Obviously, you have that article out which has a sell rating, or what you might even say shorting. Now, in my other conversation with a fellow essay contributor, Trading Places Research, he was he also, I mean, he believes the valuation on Nvidia is very high, but he does believe in the growth story. Was the way he put it. He seems to believe. I'll give you his view, and then you can rebut it and tell me what your thoughts are. He basically believes Nvidia is in a class of its own, that there is no competition right now for its GPUs, or at least for that combination of GPUs and software. And he was talking about a little bit about what you're mentioning as well, the competitors, for example, Google, who is now coming out with what they're calling AI accelerators or TPUs. And obviously,
Right.
that is how these companies are competing with NVIDIA. But so far, there is no, in his view, there is no real competition to NVIDIA. Is that how you see things, or you probably see things a little bit differently?
Actually, yeah, I pretty much so I think in the medium term there will be competition, but I generally see things this way. I don't see many competitions in the short run. I mean, basically NVIDIA's gross profits are like 60% of revenue, right? So 40% gross cost, what do you call it? Cost, what is it called? Whatever. 60% gross profit, right? So like obviously people are looking at this company and are very interested in trying to take some of their business because it's hugely profitable. Other than Apple, I've never heard of a hardware company with such high gross profits. And so what this suggests is people are going to try to take NVIDIA's share, right? For sure.
Mm-hmm.
But in the near term, I don't think, and I would agree with the other person, that there aren't any competitors to NVIDIA.
Mm-hmm.
Near term. NVIDIA with CUDA basically dominates AI. And the problem is CUDA. CUDA is basically a language that allows you to tell GPUs what to do, and is very useful in deep learning. And AMD doesn't have an alternative. There
Mm-hmm.
are people. George Hotz was one who tried to write a CUDA-like language for AMD, but he has since quit. I don't know why. He spent like 2 weeks on it. But like, I'm talking to the tech people on Twitter, right? And they are saying essentially probably the most value add AMD engineers can do right now is to write a CUDA-like language for AMD.
Mm-hmm.
So I am in agreement that until AMD writes something like that, and until Google and Facebook, sell their TPUs or their specialized machine learning computational units, NVIDIA is the only company that is the only game in town.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, my difference with the other author is even if NVIDIA captures 100% of the market, it's not going to be big enough to justify the market cap. So that's where I differ from
Okay,
the
that's
other
that's
author.
very interesting. Now, in terms of the competition, you've mentioned AMD, Google as well. Who do you think is best positioned? Like, who is actually? Because I've heard good things about what Google is doing with TPUs. What do you think about the other companies? Who's going to challenge NVIDIA for the throne, in your opinion?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, so there's one thing where Google is only offering their TPUs in the cloud because they want it as a competitive advantage. So in a sense,
Mm-hmm.
Google's not really challenging NVIDIA in the space of selling, GPUs essentially or computational units,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because they're only using their stuff in the cloud. Maybe I think their TPUs are better than NVIDIA's GPUs for large language modeling, mostly because NVIDIA still has to. I think NVIDIA is also selling specialized GPUs, but their GPUs also have to actually handle graphics, right? Because like people are still using them for playing video games and stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I imagine the TPUs are more specialized, and I'm sure they've updated it over the years. But I think a lot of people, well, I don't know if I want to say this, but again, you can only do that if you're using Google in the cloud, right? If you're going to buy a GPU on your own computer, I think NVIDIA is again the only game in town. I think of the other players, probably Google is the best position, but again, they're not selling GPUs, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
TPUs. So I would again say that like no one's in a great position. If AMD develop, so I will say one thing: if AMD develops a CUDA-like language, they will be in the best position, and they are in pretty good position in machine learning inference. So like you can train
Mm-hmm.
your machine learning models, and then inference is essentially someone types in a command like uh, explain World War II like I'm 5 years old, and the GPU or a large language model would do something like that. That's inference, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so with inference, it is much easier to use AMD GPUs because you don't need to use, there's not so much CUDA-like interface that you need in training because training is much more complex than just inference, right?
Mm-hmm.
So in that aspect, AMD is already gaining share. And I think I read in one of the comments that something like uh, newly built, servers uh, basically have, there's a large share of AMD, like higher than, 10 or 20% that you would expect by AMD's regular market share. Um, these hyperscalers are actually buying more AMDs than they used to. And probably that's because of inference.
Mm-hmm.
You don't need an NVIDIA GPU to do inference. You don't need that much CUDA to do inference. And so it's easy enough to do it with AMD, which has basically GPUs that are cheaper per flop, essentially. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sorry, that makes perfect sense. Um, it's interesting because you talk about NVIDIA. Sorry, it's interesting because you talk about NVIDIA as having a dominant market position, but obviously you probably think the valuation has gone too far at this point based on that analysis of the market share. Is there a price at which you would consider buying NVIDIA? Is that something that you're waiting for?
Yeah, I mean, so I talked about this before. This is sort of like I was hesitant to say sell because it really wasn't an article about NVIDIA's valuation or NVIDIA's financial analysis. It was really an article on the angle of this is how much large language models will demand GPUs from NVIDIA, and this is why that's false, right? And there are a lot of other aspects of the company, like I didn't touch upon valuation, I didn't touch upon their Internet of Things and their like other aspects. I did not touch upon like how they have a cost advantage in GPUs, right? Because I don't know semiconductors, I don't really pay attention to like their other aspects. I don't really spend a lot of time understanding data centers or hyperscalers. And so my main angle was coming from this is a machine learning person's take on what the demand for large language models would be. So I don't really have a valuation on buying NVIDIA. Right now it's too expensive based on
Mm-hmm.
just this demand. But again, I hope I was clear in my article and basically saying, this is not like a fully fledged stock pitch. This is really talking about one particular angle, right? And if you
Mm-hmm.
have a thesis that takes into account other stuff, I'm not saying you're wrong, and maybe it is a buy, or maybe it is, a buy. I doubt it, but I didn't do a full, what do you call it? A holistic view of the company, right? Does that make
Mm-hmm.
sense?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Now, I wanted to know a little bit more about your own background. I'm reading your profile here. It says you're a PhD economist by trade who specializes in using machine learning to improve macroeconomic models. So please go ahead and tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, so actually, I'm still a PhD student, but I guess I is not quite clear on that. But yes, so I use machine learning models to build, machine learning algorithms to build macroeconomic models, and the machine learning models I use are the same. I mean, I don't really use large language models in my work. I trained some transformers in the past, but I don't really spend that much time with them. But the main thing I spend is I do Bayesian machine learning on essentially macroeconomic models. So these are models that sort of predict implications for the economy. I will have a new article on Seeking Alpha at some point
Mm-hmm.
discussing Schrodinger, which is a company that uses sort of MCMC, so Bayesian techniques to
Mm-hmm.
do molecular what do you call it, like molecular like designing molecules and ligands for diseases. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm happy to be able to use my Bayesian, Bayesian experience to talk about that company. But that's the main thing I do, like predicting inflation. If
Mm-hmm.
people have seen the GDP now kind of models, those are the kind of models I use. Building these structural models that can predict inflation or what happens if the Federal Reserve drops interest rates by 2% or whatever. What will the impact on the economy be? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very interesting. So basically, if I'm understanding it correctly, you would take different macroeconomic indicators and put them into this artificial intelligence machine learning model to kind of forecast what your view is of the macroeconomy in the future.
Yeah, I mean, economists, uh, I don't want to say they're a little bit behind on the curve, but they do things differently than a machine learning person, right? So you're
Mm-hmm.
really capturing what a machine learning person would do. You get some data, you put it in some black box model, doesn't matter how it works, and it cranks out, an output, right? With economists, what we like to do is we like to build like really structural models. So we'll have like, this is what happens to capital depreciation, right? So at every period, capital depreciates by a little bit, And then the capital that you have remaining goes into a production function, which determines how much, goods you produce. And then the people that you have buy these goods, but they also have to balance like how much they spend now versus saving for the future. And so in a machine learning approach, you just put in all these indicators into a model. None of the parameters make any sense. They're just like random parameters, like linear regression parameters, but more complicated. And then they output a output, right? But with economics, we build all these models, so all these parameters have sort of real world analogs. And the hope is essentially that because they have real world analogs, you can understand economic dynamics more effectively. And you can also do things like counterfactual analysis, right? So you cannot say like if inflation went down by 2%, what would in this black box model you said you can't say if inflation went down by 2%, what would the output be? You can only say if inflation went down by 2% in the data, other things that are correlated with going down by 2%. What is it? What does a decrease in 2% changes correlations, right? And there's a difference between causation and correlation. With the structural model, essentially, I can make inflation go down by 2%, and this is a counterfactual environment. If I use a black box model and inflation goes down by 2%, this is a correlative model, right? So it's what in the real data is correlated with going down by 2%. Whereas in my structural model, we don't even need real data. We can use the model to sort of essentially write a counterfactual even without being disciplined by the data. It doesn't work as well as I'm making it sound, but that's what the attempt is.
Okay, well that's very interesting. So what is your model telling you now? Is that something that you're looking at now? What is it saying about inflation going forward, for example?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's the funny thing because I actually don't build these models. I actually build the math. I do the algorithmic, data crunching behind it, right? So I say like, this is how you should build your models. And then economists take the models that I build and they say, okay, we're going to forecast inflation and stuff. So I know more economics than the average person on the street, but I would say I don't know, like, I don't spend my time, really doing economics. I'm really like improving these models, right? So I spend time looking at the model and saying, this is one thing you can improve upon it.
Okay, so when you look at investing, do you focus more than on particular companies? Or do you? Sorry, I'll start again that sentence. So when you look at investing, are you just looking at particular companies then, or I mean, do you use macro at all? Do you have a particular view of what the Fed is going to do? How recession is going to affect us? So the macro isn't real. Even though you build these models, the macro isn't something you focus on so much.
Nah, it's actually kind of funny. As an economist, I understand how bad macroeconomic forecasting is. So,
Right.
I don't do it. If a company is, I guess what I do is I like, quality companies at a reasonable or cheap price, right? And if I'm gonna buy and hold for 10 years, which I don't actually do, but I'd like to do, I would like to buy quality companies, regardless of essentially the price or the economic condition. I will say though, I spend a lot of time investing in foreign countries, and then I do actually take into account things like exchange rate risk, inflation, and stuff like that, simply because in a developed country, you just take these things for granted. But if your country is returning 20% a year, in lira or whatever, you got to look at like what the inflation rate is, right?
Right, of course, of course. Now, I've been doing this thing where I get previous guests, get all my podcast guests to kind of contribute a stock to what I'm kind of calling the Pragmatic Investor Podcast Portfolio. So, is there any particular stock that you are quite bullish on? I'm looking here, for example, your first article here was on PagSeguro, PAGS, and you
Yeah.
have a strong buy rating on there.
Yeah. After earnings, I was a less I don't know, less enthusiastic about the company, let's just say. I would not put a strong buy now. I'd probably either have a buy or hold. But I have to write another article for that. I'm not going to do that.
Right. Well, is there any company right now that you are particularly bullish
Yeah.
on? Maybe on
Well,
the AI sector?
so I don't have any. Actually, I don't have any stocks in the AI sector that I'm bullish on. But I will say, do you want like? Can I give you run of the mill like a stock on the Australian Stock Exchange that has like 100 million in market cap or something like that? Or
Yeah,
do you
of
want something
course.
like S&P?
This is
Okay,
this is
so
your pick, so it can
okay,
be
I will
anything.
do. Hold on, let me see if I can find it.
I mean, anything that's reasonably investable in, not your friend's startup, because
Yeah,
unfortunately,
not my friend's
people
startup.
seeking
Yeah,
alpha
yeah,
probably
yeah.
won't be able to
Okay, so
to get access to that.
I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think. Okay, so there's a couple. So I like trailer parks in Australia. Do you want to hear that pitch? I got a couple, but so I like trailer parks in Australia. There are two sets of trailer park companies: Ingenuia Communities and Lifestyle. No, and what is the other one called? This is embarrassing because I have this stock in my portfolio. But oh well, there's Ingenuia Communities and another company. It's on my portfolio, but I've seem to have forgotten. Anyways, there's these two trailer park companies. Actually, let me just search it up.
Can you give us the stock ticker on those?
Yeah, Lifestyle Communities. Yes. So the stock ticker on Lifestyle Communities is ASXLIC. And Ingenuia. Let's see what. Uh, yeah. So ASX. Uh, So the two tickers are INA in the Australian stock market and LIC in the Australian stock market. So
Okay.
both of these are essentially trailer park companies, and the reason why trailer park companies are so lucrative is essentially you as a trailer park owner own the land, and then the person that lives with you owns the mobile home on the land. Now, mobile homes are actually sort of a misnomer. These things are very hard to move. They cost thousands, and they cost maybe $20,000 or $30,000 to build, and they cost $5,000 or $6,000 to move. So, like, it's from a sort of a economics perspective, it's really hard to move. So what does that mean? What that means essentially is you have a lot of pricing power for these communities. And even though you have a lot of pricing power, because these homes cost very little and because the land is very little, the rental price that the tenant pays is much lower than, let's say, a single family home in the suburbs of the area, right? And so when
Mm-hmm.
you look at mobile homes in the US, what essentially you see is there's a progression of price raises, right? So Sam Zell has a equity lifestyle partners or something like that, and there's other trailer REITs or trailer park REITs essentially. And what you
Mm-hmm.
see by them is I think equity lifestyle partners has basically it's had earnings growth or free cash flow growth because they're REITs, right? So
Mm-hmm.
funds from operations grows from the 1990s to 2020. Every year, the funds from operations increase without missing a beat, right? This is through the great financial crisis, this is through the housing crisis. Every year, stock went, and earnings went up, and it compounded at a CAGR of something like 20 or 30% a year over the whole period, right? So every year, right? And so you look at the U.S. market, and the U.S. market is quite saturated. It is quite hard to build new trailer parks
Mm-hmm.
because people don't like them because they associate them with, just, not as wealthy people.
Right.
And so, but you have a lot of these mom and pops operating these trailer parks that, you can buy the park and you can increase the economics by charging more for the land, right? And so Australia is just in the beginning stages of it. There aren't actually that many mom and pop trailer park operators, but there's not much regulation against building new trailer parks, and mostly
Mm-hmm.
trailer parks, when compared to rent in the in Australia, are much lower. The cost is much lower compared to a one bedroom in Australia than a trailer park in the U.S. compared to a one bedroom in nearby cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so this suggests to me that they have a lot of room for not only pricing power increases because but they can also build many more trailer parks, right? And each of these trailer parks, if you look at the dynamics based on what people charge, you can very easily get to like a cap rate of 10%, right? Or 12%, right? And if you
Mm-hmm.
have a cap rate of 10 or 12% and you're reasonably leveraged, then this is an return of equity of 30 or 20 or 30%. So
Mm-hmm.
a very effective way to compound capital by buying sort of essentially land and turning it into trailer parks. So that's two stocks I like.
Mm-hmm.
Ingenuia Communities and Lifestyle. What is it? Lifestyle Partners. I get that confused because Sam Zell's thing is also called Lifestyle Equity Lifestyle Partners,
Right.
but so I don't want to say the same thing. Yeah, Lifestyle Communities.
I'm interested then. Are you based in Australia then?
No, 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 no. I'm in Boston, Massachusetts. The reason why I like foreign companies, I spend a lot of time like this sort of Rocket, the VC firm like Rocket Internet or whatever. Anyways, there's a VC firm. Essentially, what they do is they take U.S. and Western ideas and they start out companies in the developed world. And
Okay.
so they started a couple things like Jumia. They started, which has since ended terribly, but whatever. And they do a couple of these other things that have actually turned out fairly well. But I sort of follow that idea. I look at U.S. and like developed world ideas, and I see where are these ideas being applied elsewhere, right? So one of the big ones was, of course, trailer parks, right? It's just trailer parks. I have a couple other things. Just looking at the big tech companies, like cloud is huge, so like cloud will
Mm-hmm.
be huger even in China. So I'm buying some of the. Alibaba is definitely a scary company to own at this point, but I have a small position in that, partially because I think cloud, obviously is huge in the US, will be huge there too.
It's
So
interesting
stuff
though.
like
If
that, right?
if you look at their cloud segment, I believe it hasn't been doing that well as of recent.
Yeah, 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 yeah. But I mean, I'm thinking long term, right? And again,
Mm.
yeah. So,
Yeah, it's a
but
it's a good.
them and
Sorry.
Tencent are the only companies that are really going to build this cloud business, I think.
It's an interesting way of investing. I've definitely noticed that, I've been living in Spain most of my life, and I can
Mhm.
definitely see how those trends, even in Spain, are just, I mean, quite developed, but you can see all those trends in the US kind of slowly make their way to Europe. And sometimes
Right.
I often think, oh, this is so popular in the US, I could just open this business, I'll just do my
Yeah.
microbrewery
Right.
here. And
Yeah.
um,
Right. Right. Right.
so just going back real quick to the trailer parks. So do you like this idea in Australia? What does it take exactly for the company to build this trailer park? Is essentially it's just land, and I'm guessing providing
Yeah.
some facilities, right? Some kind of
Yeah.
utilities.
Yeah, I mean, essentially land, and then you have to hook up, sort of like sewage and like electricity and stuff
Mhm.
like that, right, to each
Okay.
slot. If you want to get fancier, which I don't think people technically want to do economics wise, but you
Mhm.
can include like a rec room or like pool or something like that. But from what I've heard, that doesn't have as good economics. When you include these things, it doesn't actually attract, higher rent to justify the increase in
Mhm.
amenities. So
Okay.
I don't know what lifestyle communities and Ingenuia do, but I imagine they're pretty economical and pretty efficient with their capital.
Mhm. It's interesting. And you believe that this segment is poised to grow? So demand, people are gonna want more of these trailer parks because you mentioned they're much cheaper comparatively to living in an
Yeah,
apartment.
yeah, yeah. That's the thing. They're much cheaper and they continue to be cheaper, even though they have a lot of pricing power. Yeah, essentially yes. And the other thing is they can build more. Unlike in the U.S. where it's really hard to build anymore, it's fairly easy in Australia to build more trailer parks.
Hmm. Yeah, that's very interesting. I've also been focusing a lot on international stocks generally. I think that the good growth opportunities there, and
Yeah,
it also offers some kind of protection against these kind of trends of de-dollarization that we're seeing here. It's
right,
always good to be globally diversified.
right.
It's been great having you, Cameron. Before we log off, please tell everyone where they can find you on the internet and what you're doing on Seeking Alpha.
Yeah, I mean, you can find me on Seeking Alpha. I think I'm Cameron Fen. You can find me on Twitter, Cameron Fen1. And then I have a LinkedIn. You can just search Cameron Fen and a GitHub if you're interested in my academic work, cameronfen.github.io. And so, yeah, that's looking forward to interacting with people. Thank
All
you very
right.
much, James. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, thanks again for coming on, Cameron. It's been great talking about this stuff, And I hope we can do it again sometime.
All right, sounds good. Thanks.
All right, best of luck, Cameron. See ya.
Thanks.